This is the Comics Alternative, episode 268, a look at recent romance comics. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And it's Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, Gene.
Ding, ding. Oh, you too.
Yes.
Oh, sloppy hugs and kisses.
And we're going to do something we've never done before in the Comics Alternative. We're going to devote an entire episode to romance comics. And these are recent romance comics from such publishers as Image, IDW, Yo Books, and DC Comics. And so I'm looking forward to this. This is something that I know we've talked about romance comics in the past, but in the abstract, this will be the first time that we really dig deep into actual romance comics. Yeah,
well, and we can even talk about if some of these actually are romance comics at all. I mean, some of them kind of stretch the definition a little bit, possibly.
Exactly. And all of them are coming out this month, and so they are February releases, just in time for Valentine's Day 2018. But before we get into those titles, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that go higher than that.
And we got a big bunch of new bundles for you this month at DCB Service. Nothing above 50, but almost everything is 50. One is at 45, which is the February DC Universe New Variant Edition bundle. That one's only 45% off. Everything else is 50%. You got your DC Kids, you got your DC Miniseries, DC Rebirth, four different DC Rebirth bundles. That's a lot of Rebirth. I think that kind of. I think if you were a cat, you'd be almost halfway there at this point. There's a Vertigo bundle. There's a one Marvel bundle, it looks like, and Valiant, and DC Young Animals, which is again that's kind of my favorite DC books right now. So.
Yeah, I'm with you on the Young Animal stuff. I think that's great, and I always get the Young Animal bundles. But, whether you like your comics bundled or in single-issue form, you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service, if for no other reason, because discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Ka-ching.
See, now I wait for you to say ka-ching. It's become a pattern now.
It's my shtick.
Yes. Well, Gene, this episode will be going up on February 14th, Valentine's Day, and we thought that this time around this year we would look at recent romance comics coming out from several different publishers. And so what we're going to be discussing on this episode are the following. We're going to be looking at the first two issues of Twisted Romance, which is an anthology series coming out all month, I think one a week, from Image Comics. After that, we're going to look at issue number 1 of Justin Jordan and Donal Delay's Death of Love, also from Image Comics. And then after that, we're going to look at yet another Image comic. This is a graphic novel by T. Franklin and Jen, I don't know if you pronounce her name, Stonge. It's St-Onge.
Yeah, I've never heard it said out loud, so I don't know.
Yes, but their work is Bingo Love. And then after that, we're going to have some fun discussing the latest volume from IDW and Yo Books, Weird Love, So This Is Love. And then we're going to wrap up with a DC comic anthology, Young Monsters in Love.
I guess the Monsters makes a kind of alternative.
Yes. It's alternative enough. So this is probably the closest we get to talking about mainstream superheroes.
Yeah, they're there, but they're kind of almost tangential-ish.
Exactly. And, we did something like this back around Halloween. Paul and I did a Halloween show where we looked at recent horror titles, and DC had something very similar.
Oh, there you go.
Well, though, before we get to a discussion of those titles, I want to share some listener mail.
Mail time. Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
This message comes to us through our YouTube channel. And, Gene, one of the things I've been discovering over the past several months is more and more people are leaving us comments on our YouTube channel than are, let's say, emailing us or tweeting out or even leaving a message online through SpeakPipe. So I don't know if that speaks to our growing audience on YouTube or that just people are more apt to leave messages on YouTube than via other means. But this is actually a comment from a show that went up, I don't know, about 3 weeks ago. It was when Paul and I discussed Best American Comics 2017. And the individual who left the message goes by the name, at least on YouTube, Special Person. Okay? And Special Person writes, I don't understand. Whenever Paul introduces an interesting, complex thought, it is jettisoned from the conversation by Derek.
Boom.
So, Special Person, I apologize if I came across that way. I didn't think I was. I did send this to Paul to share it with him. I hadn't heard back from him yet. I'd be curious to see his thoughts.
He probably wrote you back and you're just ignoring it.
That's right, because I'm a manipulative co-host.
Well, you never know.
Yeah. I'll watch that. I'll try not to be dismissive and intrusive when it comes to my comments or even yours, Gene.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. But no, in all seriousness, thank you very much, Special Person, for that sounded funny. Thank you, Special Person, for leaving a comment. And, we say on the Comics Alternative almost every week, we love hearing from you guys who listen to us, as opposed to people who don't listen to us, right? They wouldn't leave us messages. But no, we appreciate hearing from our audience, whether it's words of praise or even criticisms, as long as it's not abusive. So, Special Person didn't call me a scum-sucking bastard, and that's fine. I appreciate that. But no, if you do have any kind of criticism, then don't hesitate to share that with us as well, because we learn from our mistakes.
We want to be better.
Yes. At least I hope we want to be better.
That is life. To be better. I don't know where that came from or where it was going.
Yeah, it kind of creeped me out.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It started to get a little Schwarzenegger, and then I didn't want to go there, and then I was done.
Okay, well, speaking of Twisted, let's get to our first title, or I guess titles that we're discussing, or two issues that we're discussing on this special romance episode of the Comics Alternative. And this title has romance in the title. It is Twisted Romance, and we're going to be looking at the first two issues. Now, there are going to be 4 issues of Twisted Romance, one coming out every week of February. Now, we're only 2 weeks into February, so obviously we only have the first 2 issues. And this is an anthology series coming out from Image. And in issue number 1, which came out the first week of February, it has 3 components, 2 comics and 1 prose piece, and that's what the second one has as well. The second piece in that issue, number 2, is also a prose story, and I guess the other 2 issues are going to be set up the same, right? Comic, prose, or short story, and then comic. And in issue number 1, we have the first installment is Old Flames by Katie Skelly and Alex de Campo. And then the short story, the prose short story by Magen Cubed, Leather and Lace. And then a short comic by Sarah Horrocks, Red Medusa. And then in issue number 2 of Twisted Romance, which came out this week, Twinkle and the Star by Alejandra Gutierrez and Alex de Campo. And then the prose piece, Back at Your Door by Vita Ayala. And then the short comic, Would You Even Know It by Meredith McClaren. What did you think of this Twisted Romance series from the first 2 issues?
It's kind of a mixed bag. It's doing a lot of different things, and it's not even necessarily all the same creators from one issue to the next either. So it kind of feels like an anthology that's kind of been broken down into 4 issues, rather than like. Cause at first, I was wondering if it was more like a here's a group of people kind of doing similarly themed stories, but it's more of a I guess more of a traditional anthology than that. It was a little hard to tell at first because there's no introductory material or anything like that, like telling you what this thing is. It's just here are the stories with and again, every one of them has a very, very different tone, a very, very different feel to them. Mm-hmm. And the twist is everything is twisted in one way or another. They're not like super kinky twisted or necessarily. Well, a couple of them get in that territory a little bit, but it's not typical boy and girl meet stories. They're looking at different forms, different kinds of sexuality, different different genres. Also, I mean,
right.
So, you go from what looks like kind of some are more slice of life, some are more like high fashion and monsters. It kind of goes all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you put your finger on it when you said that this reads like an anthology broken up over 4 issues. And my assumption is that in the months to come, Image will release in trade format all 4 of these issues, which in essence will be a complete anthology.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, although it'll be a little unusual to have the short story prose pieces interspersed with the comics. I mean, I have nothing against that, but I think that many readers may find that a little unusual. And so I'm curious when they collect this, and assuming that they do, if they're going to let's say, have the comics and then the prose pieces separate, right? So maybe in the first half you'll have the comics, and in the second half or the second section you'll have the prose pieces. I don't know. I would prefer that they arrange the stories as they come out in the various issues.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's it's clear that they think of those prose stories as a part and parcel of the book, because like even in the floppies, it's right in the middle. It's just another piece of the anthology. It's not marked as something different, even just because it's prose. Exactly.
And maybe I'm not giving comics readers, however we want to define a typical comics reader, there's no such thing really as a typical comics reader, but I wonder how comics readers who would gravitate toward Image titles would react to something like this where prose short stories are interspersed with comics. And I can tell you from my own experience, I mean, I love reading fiction, short stories, novels, but when I sit down to read a comic, I have certain expectations, and I'm kind of ashamed to say this, but when I pick up a comic and I see that there are these, pages of text with no comics whatsoever, I ask myself, do I want to read this? And should I skip over it? Because if I picked up a novel, or if I picked up a collection of short stories or a book of history or a biography, of course I wouldn't think, I want to skip this chapter because it's all prose. Because, of course, I picked up a book of prose. But I guess it's just my mindset when I pick up a comic. I'm looking at the combination of text and image, and when I see just text, there's something that makes me pause, although I catch myself pausing, and I'm aware of why I may do what I do. So anyway, getting back to my query, I'm just wondering how comics readers would react to something like this.
Yeah, well, I'm guessing comics readers, and myself included, often are like Alice. What use is a picture? Well, what use is a book without pictures or conversations?
Yeah.
Sorry, I taught children's literature for too long. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is seared into my brain. But I mean, like when I was a kid growing up reading like Marvel comics, I loved the text pages. The text pages were really important to me because I wasn't reading stories. I was reading a comic book, and those text pages were integral to what my idea of a comic book was, as opposed to just comics. Mm-hmm. Whereas now I'm more of a comics reader, or like you said, a prose reader, or whatever. And I think you're right. It's a different sort of headspace. And I'll admit, when I turned the page and saw suddenly the big blocks of text, I was like, "Whoa! I was not expecting that." Mm-hmm. So there was a little bit of this is non-standard.
Right. But I like that because it challenges our definition of what a comic book is. I recently was able to do an interview with Bill Cardelopoulos and Ben Catcher about last year's issue or volume of Best American Comics, the aforementioned Best American Comics 2017. And one of the things I was talking with those guys about, and especially with Ben, who was the guest editor of that volume, is I really appreciated that, probably more than any other Best American Comics volume previously, because it challenged our understanding of what a comic is. And I enjoyed that, right? There are things in there that I wouldn't consider a comic. However, depending on your definition of a comic or graphic narrative, whatever you choose to call it, there is text, there are sequential images of some sort. And so I think Ben Catcher, as the guest editor, expanded our understanding of what a comic could be. And I think in a somewhat similar fashion, Twisted Romance challenges our understanding of what a comic book could be. Because, yes, it does have comics, paneled, sequential narrative, but then you have these prose pieces. Well, why not include prose pieces, these short stories? I mean, you have letter pages in comics sometimes, right?
Right, exactly. And
yeah.
Your typical old school romance comics of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s would have text pieces as well, although generally they weren't like at the time. If it was a superhero comic, there would be like a text piece about a superhero or about a cowboy, cowboy or whatever like that. But the text pieces in romance comics often were advice columns.
Yes.
How to keep your boy, how to groom yourself, things like that. So I mean, especially in a romance comic, it's really not out of place at all.
Exactly. Now, I enjoyed issue number 2 of Twisted Romance more than I did issue 1, although that's not to take away from issue 1. I liked issue 1. The thing about issue 2 that resonated with me is that, for the most part, the stories, both the prose and the comics, were more, for lack of a better term, slice of life or realistic than genre-based. And not that I didn't like the genre-based stuff like you find primarily in issue number 1 of Twisted Romance. I just enjoyed the more realistic approach to these romance stories, these twisted romance stories, in issue number 2.
Yeah, I think maybe just that because of there's not as many genre trappings, it's focusing more on relying less on metaphor and more on just actual life experience, without filtering it through succubus or the like the Medusa again. I like in issue 1, the Red Medusa story is gorgeous. Sarah Horrocks' Red Medusa story. Mm-hmm. It's a little hard to follow,
right?
But I love looking at it. And the genre trappings are kind of part and parcel of the visual style of that story, and it's that story itself felt a little Like if you've read like Seven Miles a Second with James Romberger's and Marguerite Van Cook's art in there, it reminds me a little bit of that, with the kind of even down to the lettering and the kind of really bold use of color and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not sure I entirely followed it all the way.
Right.
It almost felt like I was in the middle of something, but it certainly gave you a sense of an experience as you're going through it. Again, but it's not it's not very straightforward. Like you said, the stories in issue 2 are a little more straightforward. Although the AI story in issue 2 is not entirely straightforward. Exactly.
Although that is, I guess, of the two that you mentioned, Horrocks' Red Medusa and then McClaren's Would You Even Know It, that AI story. Mm-hmm. McClaren's is more conventional of the two.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of Red Medusa. It may not be the easiest to follow, but I think the art is where it's at with that particular story. And these final pieces in each of the issues of Twisted Romance, Red Medusa and then Would You Even Know It, are the shortest in each of the issues. But yeah, Red Medusa is visually compelling and much more experimental. And I think it's the most experimental of anything that we've seen in either the Twisted Romance issues. Both Katie Skelly and Alex de Campo's Old Flames and then Magen Cubed Leather and Lace are stories that deal with monsters or horror-ish genres in one form or another. And in fact, I had wondered if this entire issue, number 1 of Twisted Romance, was going to have a horror feel to it. The Red Medusa, I don't know, I guess you could arguably say it does fit with the rest of the stories, or it may not. I don't think it really matters. But, you know, as much as I enjoyed de Campo and Skelly's Old Flames, I think the story that really stands out for me between these two Twisted Romance issues is Alejandra Gutierrez and Alex de Campo's Twinkle and the Star.
That one went in places that I was not expecting.
Mm-hmm. And basically, this is the story of a young woman named Twinkle who doesn't have the look of a model. However, she works with models. She is the assistant of, I guess, a fairly famous or well-respected fashion photographer, and you could tell that she doesn't like the models who work with her boss, Raymond. She herself is not tall. She's not thin. She wears these big glasses. I think she's quite attractive, very sexy, but she's not the kind of woman that, at least she thinks, that is going to attract men. A young male star. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not even sure if she thinks that she wouldn't be attractive. It's the fact that she sees all these these wafer thin women being used as kind of like just as props for these fashion photography sessions and things like that, and she gets frustrated at they're there just because they're expected to be there,
right? And
I didn't even think that she like compares herself with them in that way. It's just that I think it's a job for her, but what the job is kind of sad.
Exactly. Okay, so let me amend what I just said, because this introduces the other main character of that story, a young male actor by the name of Nick. He comes in for a photo shoot, and it's the kind of individual I think that she first thinks of him as, who wouldn't be attracted to her, who would feel a little more comfortable with these wafer-thin models. Although we learn in this story that Nick is not who Twinkle, or even we as readers, or I as a reader, would think of him as. He's definitely not shallow. He's someone who has much more depth. He's someone who is, like Twinkle, a little critical and suspicious of these model types that surround him and are basically used in the photo shoots as window dressing to kind of detract from him in the photo shoot. And so basically what we have here in this story, Twinkle and the Star, which I think is a very clever title, is we have a budding romance between this photographer assistant Twinkle and Nick, this someone like a young Harrison Ford type of character, right?
Yeah, something like
yeah. And I think the way that this story is handled is quite effective. It doesn't hit you over the head with a kind of awareness that looks aren't everything. I think it's subtle in that way. And also, as you rightly pointed out, there's something about Twinkle that she's an empowering figure. She doesn't put herself down. And, I mean, she may have certain expectations, but she doesn't sell herself short. She seems confident about herself for the most part.
Yeah, and she knows that there's something early on where she describes herself as the assistant, but also she's also in charge of the Photoshop, so she ultimately is what really makes the photos be what the editors want them to be. The photographer is the star in his way, but she's a lot more of the brains and the skill behind the final product.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I also really did enjoy the art of Gutierrez.
Yeah, it's a little not exactly cartoony, but more almost like animation cartoony, if that makes sense.
It is, and it's interesting that the stories that open each of the first two issues of Twisted Romance have a somewhat similar style. You mentioned it as cartoony. That's one way, to some degree, of describing Katie Skelly's style. It's something that is, I think, deceptively simple, not simple in a bad way, kind of more iconic than detailed, but it does have a kind of cartoon look to it, a very stylized kind of look to it.
Yeah, it reminded me a little bit of like Barbara Slate's Yuppies in Love, if you can go back to the 80s and 90s with me for a second. Mm-hmm. A little bit like that, with kind of an anime feel sprinkled into it also.
Yeah, and but
in color, and the color works interestingly in that story as well.
Yeah, well, vibrant color, and it's like other things that I've read of Skelly's. I do like her artwork, and I think it works well with this story, Old Flames, and again, both Old Flames and Twinkle and the Star were written by Alex de Campo, and I think that those are the two strongest of, I guess, the comics that we have in these two issues in terms of story.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated the prose pieces, Leather and Lace in the first issue, and then Back at Your Door in issue number 2. I really enjoyed Back at Your Door. It's a story that in some ways anticipates some of the things that we're going to be discussing later with Bingo Love, because you're talking about a romance that is between women instead of between a man and a woman. And even in today's age, the kind of things that get in the way of that kind of romance.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciated Back at Your Door. What did you think of the story of AI? Would you even know it? I know you mentioned it a little while ago. Did you particularly like that one? Did you find it compelling?
I liked it, but I also felt like I needed to spend more time with it than I had to give to it. Mm-hmm. Because we've got there's several voices happening. Again, it's basically of the main character, a woman, and her laptop, and she's talking to something possibly, but I think there's like 3 different voices happening, and I'm not always sure what's what. I mean, the whole premise of the story is to if artificial intelligence becomes self-aware and things like that. And if it gets that good, would you be able to recognize it? So again, the sort of the Turing test thing,
right? And is this young woman able to recognize and determine if this is AI she's conversing with or an actual human?
Right. And the premise is really interesting. And again, I needed to spend more time with it to really follow through. Again, it's kind of just visually, you might think, well, it's just a bunch of talking heads or a talking head. Mm-hmm. But even visually, it looks really cool. I love the look of it. It's not. If you think of if I tell you this is a story about a woman typing on her computer for like 6 pages, you go, that doesn't sound visually dynamic, exciting at all, but it really is.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I think the conceit, is this AI or not, and can you determine this? I think that is especially philosophically compelling, and that's one of the things that really drew me to this. Now, you mentioned a moment ago that there seems to be 3 voices. I think I read it differently, and let me ask you, when you said that you felt that there were 3 voices in this story, are you referring to, I guess, the color of the word balloons, which are not really balloons, but rectangles?
Right.
You have the pink, the gray, and then the white.
Right.
I wondered about that myself, but then looking at the various panels, there are some instances when this young woman is speaking in a white word balloon, and then at other times in a pinkish word balloon.
Yeah.
And then the computer speaking in the white, but at other times a kind of grayish brown. I just think that that's the way that Meredith McClaren has structured these word balloons, that sometimes they're one color, sometimes they're another. And so I didn't use the color of the word balloons as an indication of who was speaking at what point.
Yeah, I think I may have. I think my letterist fetishism is maybe was playing a little extra tricks on me because of that. Yeah, because I was assuming that because there were 3 colors, but really the colors really being used more to balance the compositions than to tag the characters, which is what I was assuming it was. So yeah, I'm a bad reader.
No, but I think it's easy to see that, because I felt at first the same thing. Because why wouldn't a creator have different colors for different speakers? Normally, that's what we would think.
Right. But yeah, no, it really now look at it again. It really is more about balancing the color composition on the pages. Mm. So I owe the story another read.
But I like these first 2 issues of Twisted Romance. I look forward to the next 2 later this month.
Yep, and the eventual collection.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a lot to discuss this week, Gene, so you want to move on to the second title that we're looking at, Death of Love, #1?
Yes, let's pull that up here.
This is written by Justin Jordan with art by Donal Delay. Is that how you pronounce his first name? It's Donal?
Donal.
Donal Delay.
I've heard Donal, yeah.
Yeah, and this is also from Image Comics. I can't recall if this is going to be a limited series or if it's ongoing for now, and depending on... Does it say on the cover?
I don't think so.
No, it just says issue #1. This is an interesting premise, or at least what we have in this first issue. And okay, let me preface what I'm about to say by first saying I do think overall this is a satisfying first issue. In other words, there's enough material here to satisfy my, to some degree, curiosity of and my understanding of what a first issue should be. On the other hand, when I got to the end of the story in this first issue, I felt that there needed to be a little more because I had a lot of questions. On the other hand, that's what compels me to pick up the next issue of Death of Love. So I think that's a good thing. Basically, we have the story of a guy named Philo Harris, and he is described by the writer, Justin Jordan, at the end. There's a short essay.
In a text piece.
Yeah, text piece again.
Yep.
He's described as a nice guy, capital N, capital G. And what Justin Jordan meant by that is he's not just a guy who is nice, but he is someone who is trying to come across as a nice person to a woman in order to get something from her, attention, sex, and what have you. He's not being nice for the sake of just being a good person. And that seems to be his weakness. So Philo Harris comes across in this first issue as a jerk, not completely, but a bit.
Mostly.
Yeah. But he's not someone that at least I hated in this first issue. He's someone who left me uncomfortable, but not someone that I wish would, get beaten up, let's say, by his friend Lydecker. Now, Lydecker is someone who I guess he's kind of Philo's foil in addition to his friend, because he will point out some of the weaknesses of Philo.
Right.
But we don't see much of Lydecker. But I think that Philo's actions more or less speak for themselves, that most readers would think, okay, this guy's a jerk, but not enough of a jerk to where you're completely turned off by him.
I don't know. I mean, in that text piece that you mentioned, where it says, where the author calls him a nice guy, how does it actually start? Let me make sure I get the words exactly correct. So he's an asshole. I mean this is a very strange book, because I mean, and I think the critters even understand it there, because that whole the text piece by the author is like, yeah, it's really hard to write a story about a really unlikable character. Mm-hmm. It even says that if there's a takeaway from Death of Love, it's don't be Philo, don't be this main character,
right?
But he's still our main character, and it's like, and it's trying to. I mean, the whole idea of his best friend Lydecker there telling Philo off is getting us to see that this whole idea of the nice guy, the guy who's nice only because he's out for sex, basically. Mm-hmm. And then we go to this kind of a, it's not exactly an MRA meeting, a Men's Rights Association, but it's like he needs to learn to be an alpha, instead of a
right?
beta.
Yeah,
right. And it was all very on the nose for me.
Mm-hmm. It is, and one of the things I enjoyed about this issue is the fact that Philo was such an asshole, that he was a jerk, and the way that Justin Jordan is using this character to make certain points. Now, there are certain characters that you hate, and there's almost nothing redeeming about them. But then there are others that you may really dislike. They're assholes, they're jerks. But to some degree, even a very minor degree, at least for me, I don't know if identifying with them is the right way of putting it, but you almost want to pull for them in some way, right? You want them to be redeemed in some fashion. And I'm thinking of, let's say in Seinfeld, the character of George Costanza, and then along with that, the character of Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Both of these characters are assholes. They're jerks. They're not the kind of people that many times you want to rely on or pal around with. However, at least for me, there's something about George Costanza, there's something about Larry David that I love. Now, I know that everyone's not like this. For instance, my wife cannot stand Curb Your Enthusiasm, and she's not a fan of George Costanza at all, from what I can gather. And I know that kind of humor can leave some people, if not cold, then very dismissive. But but I like those characters. As much of a jerk as George Costanza is, as much of an asshole as Larry David is on Curb Your Enthusiasm, there's something about them that I find compelling, that I do want them to win in the end. I do want them to get by. I do want them to learn how they've been jerks and to redeem themselves in some way.
Yeah, and at this point, like you pointed out, this is a first issue, mm-hmm. And I mean, if even our author is telling us, this main character, he's an asshole, but if you're really going to spend the time to actually create an ongoing story, whether it's a 4-issue or an ongoing or whatever about him, one would hope that he doesn't stay the person that we meet in the in this first issue,
right? And
because he's on his quest to become an alpha, and suddenly he gets to be able to beat up Cupids. He sees Cupids and gets to kill Cupids,
right? And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what I think will be the redeeming factor for this character, Philo, is this pill or this drug, whatever we want to call it, that he gets from this old guy. Okay, so after this alpha meeting, which is, that's really repulsive. He and two other men go to this bar, and each of them tries to pick up a woman, of course, with, this alpha philosophy behind them. And predictably, they fail miserably. And as they're sitting at their table nursing beers, this literally shady character comes up. And in fact, when you first see him, I don't know what page this is because this is a comic book, but it is about halfway through, like around 18 on this PDF that I'm looking at. When I saw this character, I couldn't help but think of the Joker. There's something Joker-esque about his suit, his hat, and he has a cane. But anyway, he comes up to this table of the three guys, and he says, you guys are looking sad, and he introduces himself and says, your problem is that you lack perspective. It's not a problem with you, it's the way that you look at the situation. And he says, I have something that can help you fix your perspective. And he breaks out this bottle of pills, and he holds up one, and we see a close-up of it. It's a red pill, and I think on one side is an image of an apple, and on the other side is an image of a heart. And of course, these guys say, there's no way that we're going to take pills from a stranger. And then when the stranger leaves, what does Philo do? He takes the pill. And that's what you had mentioned. Apparently, the pill allows him to see Cupids. Definitely changes his perspective. And that's, I think, leads us back to the very beginning of this issue, because it begins with Philo fighting off these Cupids or shooting at Cupids, like at war with the Cupids. And you're wondering, what the hell is this? But then the story flashes back to how we got to this point. So there's something about these pills that allows him to see Cupids. And these Cupids, they may look cute, but they don't seem to act that way.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of them, but there's the first shot of them when he first sees them, they look pretty benign, or at least they're smiling. But then we see a nasty face at the very end.
Oh yeah,
so there's more that's happening there.
Exactly. In fact, that last page that you mentioned before we get to Jordan's brief essay is one of my favorites.
Yeah, because we found out that these are not the shy type, the cute little Cupids that we see on Valentine's.
Exactly.
But and I'm wondering about again why. Again, my initial reaction was like that everything was kind of like on the nose and pretty much like painfully obvious. Yes, he's an asshole. Yes, the whole alpha philosophy is abhorrent and things like that. But there's little things, they're playing with things here, like his name, Philo. That's Greek for love. Mm-hmm. And the shadowy figure who they keep calling Aaron, because they misunderstand, the shadowy figure's name is Eris, who's coded male in the story, but Eris is the goddess of strife and discord. Mm-hmm. And we've also got the Cupids in here. So there may be some deeper mythological stuff. There's clearly deeper mythological stuff bubbling about the surface, and I'm just wondering how deep that's going to go as the story continues.
Yeah, well, another thing compelling about this series, right? I mean, I want to go on to read issue number 2, 3, so on and so forth, just to see how this plays out.
Yeah, it's more. The more we talked about it, the more I felt. The more I actually kind of enjoyed it. I think. Mm-hmm. I think again. So talking about it with you actually opened things up. You didn't shut me down, Derek. You actually opened my brain.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad I wasn't dismissive of your approach, your complex idea that you introduced. Another thing that I think draws me to this title is I like Justin Jordan's writing. He's known for Luther Strode, that series, and then I think The Spread is just recently wrapped up, and I really enjoyed The Spread. I didn't read all of it. I need to really go back and read the entire series, but I loved what I read. And he's done other things as well that I've appreciated. So when I saw that he was the writer of Death of Love, I definitely wanted to give this a try.
This is the first I've read his work or seen the artist's work either. So,
yeah, it's the first I think that I've seen of the artist Donal Delay, but I like the art.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a little. It's not exactly. Well, some things are a little exaggerated. Like Philo's face is like he's got the deepest V-est chin you've ever seen in the world, and most people aren't super cartoony, but it's kind of cartoony in an expressive way.
Right. I like the expressively exaggerated style of Delay.
Yeah, and he draws a mean-looking Cupid.
Mm-hmm. Literally a mean-looking Cupid. Okay, you want to move on to the other image title that we're going to be looking at this week?
Yes, Bingo Love.
Bingo Love. This is written by T. Franklin with art by, and again, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, Jen Stonge, St-Onge, and that is how the name is spelled on the cover and on the copyright page. Now, this is not a series or an issue in a series from Image, but this is a graphic novel. And this is coming out this week as well. This is a book that is apparently targeted to younger readers around teenage or the age of teens. And if you look at the back cover, you do see that it's rated T for teen. It deals with LGBT romance, and so it is. This is what I was alluding to earlier when I mentioned that story in Twisted Romance #2, Back at Your Door, by Ayala. And so basically what we have here is the story of not just an LBGT story, but an LGBT story of grandmothers. Which sounds unusual, but basically what we have is the story of Hazel, who's also known as Elle, and Mary. And Hazel, I guess most of this graphic novel is Hazel telling the story of her relationship with Mary. How she first met her, how she developed a relationship with her, how she eventually lost her, and then late in life found her again, and then actually had the kind of relationship with Mary that she'd always wanted as a younger person. And it begins with, we have to be careful here because there is a narrative frame to this graphic novel. If we give too much away about the narrative frame, I think we're approaching spoiler territory.
Right, yeah.
Right. So I don't want to say too much, but the book begins with someone talking with Hazel or Elle in the year 2038 at an older citizen's home, right? This is the Jenkins Home for Seniors. And this woman is crying and says, "My parents found out that I like girls and they kicked me out. Can I stay with you, Elle?" And Elle says, "Of course you can. I'm truly sorry that your parents kicked you out. I've been where you are, honey, but it was even worse in my day. Being gay wasn't as accepted as it is now. I've hidden my love for a woman for 50 years. And then we get her story. So we're taken back to 1963 in Paterson, New Jersey. And Mary is the new girl in class. And Hazel, or Elle, is taken by her. They become close friends. They develop a relationship. Hazel is so taken by Mary that she wants to marry her, although in that day and age, that's something that is strictly forbidden. And that's what much of this story is about. And so Hazel, or Elle, lives a more or less conventional life. She marries someone. Her husband goes off to war in Vietnam, comes back. They have a family. They raise children and then grandchildren. And then as a grandmother, Hazel finds again Mary, who also has had her more or less conventional life in the interim. And they get together in a way that they had wanted to when they were younger.
And again, it's taking place again. It starts what, in 63 is when it starts.
Mm-hmm. It's the earliest, February 63.
Yeah, February 63. And so we've got, again, there are two African-American girls also. So you've got, so in the background of this, kind of floating in the background, is our racial tensions as well, which don't get touched on nearly so much. But if you know the time period at all, that there's kind of that kind of hanging over it also.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that raises a couple of issues that I wanted to discuss with you, Gene. The race issue, and also the audience expectation. Now, we've already mentioned that this has a teen rating, so it is intended for younger readers. Now, because of that, I'm not expecting a 100% realistic narrative, right? So there may be parts of this story that are tidied up, that are a little nicer and less disruptive, let's say, than something intended perhaps for a more mature or older audience. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is, we mentioned that the story of Hazel about, how she loved another woman begins in 1963. We're in Paterson, New Jersey. Now, I did not grow up in New Jersey in the early 1960s. I grew up in school, at least, in the 1970s in Charlotte, North Carolina. We see a classroom that is highly integrated in terms of race. And I don't know, when I saw that struck me as a little unbelievable. Maybe it isn't. Maybe I'm not giving Paterson, New Jersey enough credit, for their early 60s race relation intermixing. I don't know, in their educational system. But it did strike me as a little Disney-fied. But again, this is intended for a younger audience than me.
Yeah, definitely. And it's that's sort of what I was poorly talking about before with the fact that when it is set that there's race relations in the kind of bubbling in the background, but we don't see it really happening like that. But you said, like you say, that it's a very integrated classroom, and she's not the new black girl; she's just the new girl, and it's not. That's not the issue here, because this has a very specific focus as to what it's about. It's not a story about race nearly as much as it is about gender and sexuality.
Right.
So, but also it's important that they are black, because it gives you the kind of some of the social settings, the church settings, the family expectations as well. So there's some of that as well, but it's also meant, again, to be a way to introduce these topics to again teen. For me, this feels like kind of even a younger teen audience.
Right. Now, what you just said, I think, makes a lot of sense, and I agree with some of it, and other things you said, I don't know, I look at it a different way. I would argue that there is absolutely nothing in Bingo Love about race at all, outside of the fact that our main characters are African American. On the other hand, I do think that that's highly significant, as you point out, and I certainly agree with you there, because I think that what Franklin and Stange, again, I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, I think what they're doing in Bingo Love is similar to what, for the most part, the Hernandez brothers do with Love and Rockets. There are those parts of Love and Rocket stories from both Gilbert and Jaime that does bring Latino culture to the fore, but more times than not, the Latino-ness of their characters is not discussed at all. It's not even an issue. And so what the Hernandez brothers do for the most part in their Love and Rocket stories is they normalize Latino culture, right? They make it to where it's not really their focus. And you could read their characters as Latino, you could read them as white, you could read them as black. It doesn't matter. The kind of things that they go through are things we can all relate to, but they're Latino. And I think something very similar is going on here in Bingo Love. The fact that Hazel and Mary are African American, I think it's significant, but what they're doing is they're normalizing issues of race to where race doesn't become an issue. And in fact, I wondered, because early on when we see Hazel and then when Mary comes to school, Mary is noticeably lighter skinned than Hazel, who is quite significantly darker. And in fact, Hazel does describe her as this kind of lighter, almost light chocolatey color. I wondered if this would be an element of the story, but it never does.
No, you're exactly right. That it doesn't really affect that at all. It's more about it's more about, I guess, people,
right,
who happen to be black and people who happen to be lesbian or bisexual, and this is just what life is,
right. But I think that the focus of this narrative is the LGBT community and what they have to go through and how they have been historically, or at least in mid to late 20th century, viewed by others, and how restrictive that has been in terms of their own romances and their own relationships. And I think by introducing an added twist of race, maybe they thought that they would be complicating things in such a way that they didn't want, or maybe they would be turning the light away from the LGBT community. I'm not sure. Again, I don't fault them in not bringing up issues of race, although it is interesting that since we're dealing with two African-American young women in school, and it takes place beginning in 1963 with the story, you automatically think of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King in the 1960s, right? But that's nowhere in this story.
Right.
But you're right that black culture is introduced, the church, and, perhaps even the bingo game. I don't know if that's a part of black culture, but a lot takes place in bingo games, thus the title, Bingo Love.
Right. And even the wedding, there's a wedding near the end also, and that there are cultural signifiers throughout.
Right. But it's not dealt with those. Not heavy-handedly, and not in a way that would draw attention to it. You could tell this same story with Latino characters, with Asian characters, with white characters, bringing in their own ethnic signifiers. And I think you could be doing something very similar to what these creators are doing with Bingo Love.
Yeah, I'll throw one thing out, though, which I didn't get a chance to follow up on. There are two very strange footnotes in this book, which direct you to further parts of the story, which are available only digitally.
Oh, that's right, because something...
There's a story about Elle's husband. He has a secret as well, and you can kind of figure out what it might be. But it says to learn what the secret is, check out that, and then there's also a honeymoon tie-in comic also.
Yeah.
So there are two big chunks, and I'm not sure. I'm wondering if that was a conscious choice to do it that way, or if the story just got too big and we can streamline it this way, and we can have the other stuff available digitally, which is a perfectly reasonable way to do it. Academic publishers do this now. If you want to read the index of this book, go online. We didn't have the money to put those pages in this book. So there might be something like that, but I'm just wondering because I didn't get a chance to look at those yet to see what other issues might be addressed in those stories also, especially the story of Elle's husband.
Now, okay, so I'm trying to look for the page where that first note, the one that you just referred to, the note about the husband. I'm not. This is one of the
page 69.
Okay, yeah, this is one of the drawbacks of discussing a PDF text because they're not as easy to get to a particular page.
Right.
Page 69, you say?
60. Yeah, I think it's like 69 or 70.
Oh, I see.
68.
It says, find out what James was hiding in Bingo Love Secrets by Sean Pryor and DJ Kirkland, a digital release.
So it's even by different people.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's funny, when I first read this, I thought that maybe this was a piece of music that you could find digitally just because Sean Pryor and DJ Kirkland. Now, DJ may be just the initials, right?
Right.
But I wondered about that. So if this is a digital comic or a digital narrative of some sort, then where do we find it?
Yeah, well, there is a bingolove.com, which is probably the place where you would go. And again, I just ran out of time. I was going to try to track that down because 81 also mentions the Honeymoon comic also.
Right. And in fact, I'm going to bingolove.com.
I believe that's what it was.
Okay, because I went there and it is a non-site.
Well, where did I see that? Oh, bingolovecomic.com.
Ah, that makes sense.
That would be different.
We should, we're both researchers. We should have looked this up before we turned our mics on.
I meant to.
Yeah. Okay, so apparently it is somewhere on this site. So, yeah, it'd be, I'm going to look this up once we finish recording. And because I'm curious about, especially Elle's husband's secret that he kept from her.
Right, yeah. The Honeymoon one doesn't say... Oh, it's two different people again, but the Honeymoon comic as well. So again, our Indicia page here tells us that it's written by T. Franklin, and Bingo Love was created by T. Franklin. So it looks like it's like a very small shared universe, because again, she and Jen Stange or Saint Ange or however it's pronounced, I really wish I knew, created the main story. And then two people created one other story, another two people created another story. This could be a lot more complex. It's got the potential to be really, really interesting, especially when you get different perspectives on this as well. Because it looks like men doing the story of Elle's husband also.
Mm-hmm. Now, I just looked up one of the names, DJ Kirkland, in the search function on this website, and it came up with nothing for Kirkland. So... Again, I'll look this up once we finish, but I do think that this is interesting, and not just an interesting premise or basically what this story is about, but also, as you'd mentioned, we have maybe an expanded world beyond the pages of Bingo Love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I think the story itself is interesting because it, even like we said, it might be aimed for kind of younger teen readers, but it introduces a lot of really complex emotional situations, especially because we've got the two women, like you said, they separate. They are separated. They are both made to marry, and they both accept those marriages. But and then we get to kind of see the ramifications of what it does to them, especially to Elle, but and also to her husband as well. I mean, they actually have Frank talking about, well, I thought you were happy. I thought you were happy. Well, what actually is happiness? Right. It gets to some really interesting questions.
Right. And what is even more interesting, I think, than the tensions between Elle and her husband once she confesses to him that she's always loved Mary is the tension between Elle and her children. Right. Especially her daughter, who was named after her old love, Mary. What, Marion? Is that her name?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, that becomes an interesting relationship, and how at first her children were the ones who seemed to be the most offended by this relationship, or at least her daughter, but then she eventually comes around. So I think what it does in terms of family dynamics, and not just Elle's family, right? Because there are the grandmothers of both Elle and also Mary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it shows. There are a lot of ways to look at a relationship, or a lot of ways to look at how your self-image changes the way people look at you. And so, yeah, we've got there's a lot of complex ways, even just within the family, much less society. That's kind of brushed aside. It's more about all the different family interrelationships that you have.
Exactly. Another significant thing about Bingo Love is that it introduces LGBT issues in an older population, which you almost never get, right? Because usually when there are these kind of narratives, you're dealing with younger individuals as protagonists, or maybe even young adults, middle-aged. But here we have a story about grandmothers, in essence. And so what it does is it humanizes the elderly in ways that I think most people may not initially think of. And I think that's wonderful. also in terms of age, and again, I don't want to give anything away, but there are some complications toward the end of this narrative that make this story even more moving, especially regarding the relationship between Elle and Mary. Again, if this were if the protagonists were younger, then that wouldn't have been an issue. So I think that this is an interesting choice on the part of Franklin and Stange to make their protagonists quite older.
Yeah, again, even if some things are a little simplified or made a little easier to digest for a younger reader, it's still doing things that a lot of narratives, like you said, especially because it's dealing with older characters and older love as well, just you don't see almost anywhere.
Exactly.
So yeah, I definitely want to track down those other two.
So, Gene, you want to move on to our first non-image comic selection for this week.
Okay, that would be Weird Love, So This Is Love, Volume 6 of the collected Weird Love series, edited by Clizia Cusoni and Craig Yo.
That's right, our friends Craig and Clizia. If you don't know what Weird Love is, well, first let me say, where the hell have you been? This is one of Craig and Clizia's ongoing series. I think it comes out, quarterly? And so what they do is, in Weird Love, they collect older romance comics. And unlike the Haunted Horror series, which are primarily, if not exclusively, pre-code, I think most of the stories in this volume, at least, of Weird Love are pre-code, although some were published after the Comics Code into the 1960s. And so it's a really interesting mix. I mean, there are things from, let's say, 1951, 1952, but you also have comics that were published in the mid to late 1960s. Yeah.
Right.
And so what Craig and Clizia do is they take the individual issues of Weird Love, as they do with the individual issues of Haunted Horror, and they pull them together into various volumes. And so this is the 6th volume of Weird Love, and it has the title, as you mentioned, Gene, So This Is Love, which is really funny because on the cover of this volume is an image from one of the stories where you see a woman bound and gagged in a chair, and behind her is a police officer that you're expecting that, he's there to save her. But with the title of this, So This Is Love, this is Craig having fun.
But that's the actual title of that story.
Exactly. And I'm sure that the original creators of that story were also having fun, but I think that Craig is having even more fun with this, because that's the kind of humor that Craig has. For anyone who listens to the Comics Alternative, we absolutely love Craig Yo. He is the most interviewed guest we have had on the Comics Alternative, and probably will always be, as many times as we've interviewed him. And we really love the kind of stuff that he does with Yo books, both the horror stuff and with this romance and other works that he comes out with. He does a lot with Archie, with Steve Ditko. He's done quite a bit of number of collections in the past. So, Craig is an incredible comics archivist and historian, and he keeps a lot of this stuff alive and actually brings it to our attention that we probably wouldn't even know existed. I mean, it's one thing to talk about older romance comics. It's something else entirely to get them in the Weird Love collections. And because of Craig and I guess Clizia's sense of humor, it does have a weird twist to it. And so one of the things that's so much fun about reading these stories in the Weird Love collections is you can read them for what they are literally, but at the same time, at least I'm reading them with this jaded 21st century, almost smirking sense of what were these guys thinking when they created these stories? Because, in many ways, it's kind of easy to make fun of them, but in a good-natured way.
Yeah, and again, what they're choosing. I mean, it's not just romance comics. It's weird. They're finding the definition of weird is very, very broad, because I love old romance comics. I collect them myself, actually, and they generally it's a weird genre, and the stories are often weird in the sense of they're bizarre. You read it and you go, I can't believe people thought this way, or things like that. But they'll do that, or they'll do their theme issues. Like there's one of the issues that makes up this collection was all about like teacher-student romances.
Yeah,
and which is a topic that should make you feel a little weird, but there's so many stories like that. It's not as uncommon. I mean, just look at the news. I mean, these type of things still go on, but the way these things are imagined in these stories are interesting. The teacher ones are especially interesting if you look at the pre-code, the pre-1954 versus the post-1954 stories. Also,
yeah,
the kind of messages and the things that people and the comics creators are allowed to get away with.
Right. I'm glad that you mentioned the stories that deal with teacher-student romance, or the potential of teacher-student romance, because one of the things that struck me about this volume of Weird Love is that there are several teacher-student stories coming one right after the other, and then in addition to and they're about in the middle of this text, and then there are other stories as well that deal with romance or potential romance between an older and a younger individual, usually an older man and a younger woman, that don't take place in an educational setting. But there are these several stories that we find here that in one way or another deal with student-teacher relations arranged together.
Yeah, and one of those stories is I think it's one that you're saying it's not, but like the older man is the school engineer. I'm not sure what the engineer of a high school actually is. I think he's like maybe he's like the super janitor or something.
Yeah,
he keeps stokes the boiler. I don't know what this 45-year-old engineer is doing. Much less in the school, much less taking out a 16-year-old girl. But
yeah, and in fact, the woman who wrote the introduction to this volume, Rebecca Servan, makes the point that character, this older guy who is the super janitor at this school, looks disturbingly a lot like Jameson in the Spider-Man. J. Jonah Jameson, yeah, in Spider-Man. But it's funny because I hadn't considered that one of the student-teacher educational stories, but I guess to some degree it could be because if he works for the school, it's almost like a teacher.
It's kind of grandfathered in as a school story. Yeah.
One of those though that occur in the middle of the book, these teacher-student stories that I thought really stood out is Teacher's Pet. And this is
I've got a star next to that one.
Yeah, and the thing that strikes me, or one of the things that made this stick out for me, is the fact that I think it's the only instance, unless I'm forgetting something, in this collection where you have a male narrating the story. Because otherwise, it's young women saying, well, let me tell you about this romance that I had, with this older guy or with someone who didn't understand me or someone who was very much into sports or his job and not me, whatever the case may be. But in this story, Teacher's Pet, it's a young high school male who is narrating how he has the hots for his older female teacher, a substitute. So, hot for teacher. Mm-hmm. And it's about the relationship that he wants to have with her, and she almost falls for, but then doesn't because she pulls back for various reasons. It's those various reasons that is an additional part of the story that made me stand up and notice, because doesn't she say?
Oh, we got to spoil this one because it's important to spoil it because it matters at the end too.
Well, and also Servan spoils it in her introduction, so we can go ahead and say it.
Right.
So go ahead.
She's attracted to him because she reminds him of her dead brother. So that's not strange.
An extra layer of creepiness.
Yeah, and it's not just that they spend time together. It becomes much more than that. I mean, there's actual kissing, but even before the kissing, it's very inappropriate. It's all right, Bob. When we're not in class, you may call me Helen.
Yeah. Okay. And what she says, I think, adds an even further level of creepiness, right? Okay. So when she confesses to him why she is attracted, she says, I had a brother. We loved each other dearly. We were much closer than the usual brother and sister. He was older than I, and after Mother and Dad died, he brought me up and was father and brother in one. I worshipped him. Okay, so she's confessing that she's drawn to him, this young high school kid, because he reminds her of her brother that she had an unusually close relationship with. In addition to that, he was like the brother, a father to her. Makes you wonder.
Yeah, that's a little odd. Yeah, so of course it can't happen. And she tells him, you'll get over it. Someday you'll meet some wonderful girl your own age to fall in love with. And eventually he does. In 3 panels, he does.
He gets over her just
and why does he love her? She kind of reminds me of Helen. It's just a vicious circle. Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that it just adds like nobody's going to learn anything from this story.
And in addition to what you just said, that this new young love interest reminds him of the teacher, the substitute teacher Helen. He says before that, lately he's trying to forget Helen. Lately, I've begun to think of her as more of an older sister.
I miss nice.
God,
nice. I miss that. Yeah. Wow. This is messed up stuff.
Yeah.
But in this one, actually, this is from 1961. So this is not this is under the comics code. Looking at this stuff very closely, but this is still wrong.
Okay. Tell me if you got the same feeling, but this character, the substitute teacher Helen, does she remind you of Joan Collins?
There's certainly some Joan Collins happening in that face, definitely. Yeah, there's some...
And this is before Joan Collins became a star, but still. Maybe it's visually predictive.
Something like that, yeah.
Now, the story that follows that one is another one of these teacher-student romance stories. This is High School Affair. The thing that kind of creeped me out, or at least caught my attention in this story, is the final panel. And again, I don't think this is anything like a spoiler. You get the teacher and the student kissing in the background, and in the foreground is the young high school student's former boyfriend looking at us reading this comic and saying, what do you know? Looks like you'll be getting 2 official documents soon, a graduation diploma and a wedding license. And by the way, I think that this guy sounds kind of like that. He has kind of a cheesy accent of some sort. And he has this kind of Danny Kaye flaming red hair look. He's wearing a bow tie. So he's almost in this last panel something like comic relief.
Yep. It's inappropriate.
Yeah.
but yeah, he seems to be fine. He seems to be fine with it. And this is happening right after she dumps him.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, like literally, he's still there after she dumps him, and then she meets, and then she and the old man get together, and he's just, oh yeah, well, whatever. And before that, he's 5 panels before that, they're gonna let's you and I go someplace where we can make some plans about our future. Whatever.
Yeah. He gives up easily.
Yeah. Well, so many of these stories are just bizarre.
Yeah.
One of my favorites, if we jump back to one of the very first stories, let me just see if I can grab the page number real quick here.
And again, we're looking at PDF page numbers, right?
Right. Well, I'm looking at but the page numbers themselves are only like 2, so that's good. But the book starts off with a couple of with some of the original covers, which we don't get in the individual comics
of Weird Love.
The Weird Love comic books themselves.
Right.
Yeah. So there's that. But then we go to our second story, which is on page 30, Built for Love.
Oh, I'm glad you pointed that out.
God, I love Built for Love.
Yeah.
This is, again, the title is like a very good Will Eisner, Built for Love. The words built and love are made out of pieces of wood that have been nailed together. And it's about a man who's building a house. There's so much that's wrong with this story, even down to the fact that I'm pretty sure this is the very first story. We don't know who, we often don't have credits on these stories. We don't have a writer or artist credit in this one. And from 1951, we certainly almost never know the letterer of a story. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure whoever lettered the story, this was the first story they ever worked on, because every single set of words has quotation marks around it.
Yeah.
Speech balloons and thought balloons. I'm pretty sure in the typed script, the quotation marks were there, so the letterer just said, well, that's what's on the script, and put it in. So everybody looks like... I posted a panel from this on Facebook, actually. And one of my friends said maybe everything they're saying is ironic.
Yeah, I wondered about that. It's like, are they being ironic? Are they quoting people throughout the entire comic? Yeah, this was strange.
It's so awkward.
Yeah. Okay. Another thing about this story, Built for Love, that really stood out to me, in addition to the quotations, right? This is on page 33. I know this is pre-code, but we're getting quite a bit of cleavage or breast revelation, if you want to look at it that way, in some of these panels, because in the middle of page 33, when the female protagonist, she can't get this man who's building the house out of her head, right? So she's at home and she's lying in bed and she's thinking, Dan certainly is handsome. I've never met anyone like him. I think I'm falling in love. And I had to do a double take at first, because at first I thought that the contours of her breast were apparent through the fabric, but actually she's wearing a gown or a robe that is falling open, and you can almost completely see her top. And then the next panel is her getting out of the shower, and again, you can't see things completely, but you can see quite a bit.
Yeah, it's probably not a surprise to say that these comics were often, if not primarily, drawn by men.
Yes.
But again, they're drawn for generally what was expected to be probably a mostly female readership also. So it's strange that the artist is really getting his cheesecake off in drawing the story for girls. But speaking of the way that the things are drawn, on the very next page, page 34, is one of these crazy pages where the layout is pretty baroque, and you need arrows to show you which way you have to go to read. It's like the story's about a man building a house, and this page is not built well at all. This page does not have a solid foundation to stand on,
right,
whatsoever. And then the potential mother-in-law looks like a Teddy Roosevelt in drag.
Yeah, I mean, there's one panel of her toward the end that looks quite distorted in terms of proportion.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's like we have a low-angle shot, right, if it were film, and we're looking up at this gigantic mother who is filling the panel. I don't know, it just seemed really strange.
Oh, it's all weird. And again, the idea of the story is that Jane has a dog that tends to run away, and when the dog runs away, the dog winds up at this house where this man is building a house, which leads to my favorite line in all of comics. When she and he first meet, she says, "It looks good, but I don't think you got the joists close enough together." and he with a pipe in his mouth, looking like either J.R. Bob Dobbs or Mark Treo's younger brother. "Now hold everything. What does a pretty girl like you know about joists?" It's just the dumbest thing. But the way that the story gets wrapped up, the romance gets solved very, very quickly with the cheesiest "I love you" panel ever. It literally looks like a Halloween candy has been laid down on top of the panel.
Yeah, in the middle of the panel. Yeah, when they're holding each other. Another thing that is so overt that it's ridiculous, and not in terms of romance, but in terms of Cold War politics, is Iron Curtain Romance. And this originally appeared in 1960 issue of My Romantic Adventures, which is an ACG publication. And this is one of the longest, if not the longest pieces in this volume. It's the story of a young Russian woman named Sonya Lubyanka. And it begins with her telling us, probably everybody's heard of me by now, Sonya Lubyanka, Russian-bred notorious communist. And then we get her story. But by the time we get to the very end of her story, she and her new American boyfriend, they're going to get married, are standing in front of an American flag. And basically, this is the story of how she becomes, as she puts it in this last panel, she becomes a fine American girl.
Exactly.
This is definitely a story of its time.
Yeah, the Kremlin never forgets or forgives.
Yeah. They're just, you can tell that a story like this is what Craig would jump on, right? Because it's so overtly ridiculous, especially to our contemporary eyes. And not only in terms of the romance, but the Cold War politics that's going on here.
Yeah, when we see her as a young child with a teacher, and everybody's heard of propaganda, but how many of you know what it really is? So here's the propaganda, the teacher talking. In this story of Cinderella, we see the abuses of capitalism. Her poverty made her wish to be what she should have hated, a princess. And then the next panel is her in pigtails marching with a flag saying, "Long live Stalin." So it's just lovely. And we have to at least mention the very, very last story in the book. When You're in Love, which basically turns out that, the story that when you're in love, the other person always looks more beautiful to you once you fall in love with them. Mm-hmm. Well, the idea of this story is that you physically do become more beautiful when you are loved. And when the two people are in love, suddenly people say, weren't those two people ugly? But now they're very attractive.
Yeah. Again, and this story that you're mentioning now, originally I'm looking for the date. Yeah, 1953. This is one of the earliest, I think, stories in the collection.
Yeah.
It's easy for us in the year 2018 to look at these stories in a jaded way and have fun with them, but it makes you wonder, 50, 60, 70 years from now, what are people going to be thinking about the comics that we look at seriously today?
I don't look at anything seriously.
Now, obviously Gene and I don't have time to talk about every story in the 6th volume of Weird Love. But before we move on, are there any other stories that you wanted to highlight in Weird Love? So This Is Love?
I could talk about everyone, but yeah. I don't want to pick out any other specific one at this point.
One thing I will mention, though, before we move on is the story Swinger, and this originally appeared in Teenage Love in 1965. And this is one of the several stories originally from a Charlton publication.
Oh, yeah.
That was scripted probably by Joe Gill. The very first panel of Swinger, and this is the story of a young woman who has a relationship with a young boy, and it seems to be satisfying, but there's something missing, and she's not sure exactly what. One of her friends takes her or convinces her to go to this club where you get these kind of rebel types, right, who hang out. They ride motorcycles, and they swing. But their version of swinging may be different from what I guess our version of swinging might be.
Yeah, there's some pretty fake hep dialogue.
Exactly, yeah. Which, again, makes it fun to poke fun at. But the thing that I like so much about this story is that very first panel, and you see the protagonist dancing with one of these swingers, and the look on her face and how she's holding up her skirt as she's dancing, she just looks ridiculous. And one of her friends says, "I never thought Dory would really swing like that." And just the expression on her face is priceless.
Yeah, it's almost a little Dan DeCarlo Archie, but not really. But it's a little off kilter for what the rest of the book actually looks like.
Yeah, I think if Archie or the characters from Archie were on something like Ecstasy, then perhaps that's what this would look like.
Yeah, and the moral of this one basically is be a normal. Don't look over the fence.
Yes.
Don't try to see what's happening anywhere else. Just be what you are. When she looks like when she takes off her ridiculous dress that she went to in this other town, the one that she dances bizarrely in, and remove her makeup as soon as I got home, we see a full page, a full length panel of her looking in the mirror. I look like a different person, more like the real me.
And she's in pajamas, isn't she?
It's pajamas. It looks kind of like a prison uniform, doesn't it? It looks like she's in prison, and this is where she needs to be. Literally. I mean, God, I love these. They're so insane.
Yeah. So this is love. Yeah. Good stuff. But we need to move on to the last title that Gene and I are going to be discussing on this episode, and this is from DC Comics, Young Monsters in Love. And this is another anthology collection. This is, 80-some pages?
It's an official 80-page giant.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, this is the closest, as I think I mentioned, that we will get to talking about mainstream superheroes, because we have stories here with many of DC's big characters, such as Swamp Thing, Demon, there's Solomon Grundy, Frankenstein, Agent of Shade, Man-Bat, but also relatively minor characters as well. Like we have an Eye Vampire story, we have Creature Commando story, which is actually one of my favorites of this collection, and then Monsieur Mala and the Brain. So that's really reaching for it here. But we definitely do get appearances from other DC characters like Superman, right, and Batman.
I just have to say I'm very happy that you included Man-Bat as one of the more recognizable characters, because he's not.
Well, probably more so than Eye Vampire.
Well, than Monsieur Mala.
Yeah, or
sure.
Monsieur Mala, yeah. Well, what did you think of this collection, Gene? Because when I actually suggested this kind of at the last minute. You and I had already decided to discuss these other titles, but then I got a copy of Young Monsters in Love, a digital copy, and I said, if we have time, we can throw this into the mix. And you told me that you were thinking about getting this.
I saw it in on the rack of my local comic book shop, Comics Revolution, Evanston, ka-ching. And I saw it, and it looked wacky enough that I was vaguely interested, but it was like $10. And you know what? For wacky, I don't know that I want to spend $10 just on wacky.
Yeah.
But it's good. There's some interesting stuff here. I mean, the Man-Bat story is drawn by Kelly Jones, so that's a plus. Again, we're not going to talk about every single story in here because there's like a dozen. But the Man-Bat story is weird because it's sort of a love story, but it's almost. I think the lesson of this story is learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all, which is not what I expected from a Man-Bat story drawn by Kelly Jones. But there you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you. I thought that one was kind of a standout story. But, along with that piece, which is written by Kyle Higgins, and it's called Nocturnal Animal, I think most of the stories in this collection are quite touching. And quite touching is not a phrase you usually use in the DC universe.
Right, or with monsters.
Or with monsters within the DC universe, yeah. And so, yeah, the characters that are the focus in this anthology are monster or monster-ish type characters that have been a part of the DC universe in the past. So, I mean, obviously, characters like Man-Bat, Solomon Grundy, and then Frankenstein from Frankenstein Agent of Shade. But then there's some that are not monster-ish, but I guess you could make the argument that they may be. Like, for instance, I'm thinking of Deadman and Raven. Mm-hmm. I mean, I normally wouldn't think of them as monsters, but in certain ways, I guess they are because, you know, Deadman is a specter-type figure who inhabits bodies, and Raven is a character who has this link to the supernatural world. So,
yeah, it's kind of a guilt by monster by association, sort of. But I got to say, I'm as somebody who bought New Teen Titans #1 off a spinner rack at the drugstore, this is not the Raven that I'm used to. But hey, it's 40 years later, so. Yeah. But it's a much more hip kind of a hip emo goth Raven. Not that she wasn't those things before, but in kind of a different way.
Well, okay, you've already mentioned that the Man-Bat story, Nocturnal Animal, was one of the standouts in this collection for you. Which other story stood out?
They're all, some of them are interesting to me in different ways. Visually, I really like the Swamp Thing story.
Mm-hmm. And that's written by Mark Russell with art by Fraser Irving.
Right, yeah. It's a very green story. It looks like it was drawn with sponges and moss, basically, or colored with sponges and moss. It looks absolutely gorgeous. The one thing is that it feels like such a momentous moment in Swamp Thing's life, but I haven't read a new Swamp Thing comic book in a long time. So this the love story in here between him and Terry Farms, which was, that name's a little on the nose, but I don't know if she was in the books before or not, because it feels like this could have been like a 3-year-long story arc, actually, kind of a distilled down into one story. The story almost feels too good and too important to be a short story.
Right.
And it does have one really good pun, though. When somebody's looking up for an assassin, they go to Craigslist.
Yeah. Well, you know, what you just said about the Swamp Thing story leads to a question that I had for you, Gene, and that is, for those who aren't familiar with some of these characters, like, for instance, if they have no clue who Man-Bat is, or they've never read a comic with Deadman, do you think that individuals could pick up this collection and appreciate everything?
I don't know about everything. I mean, I think every story, even for some of them, like for me, the I, Vampire one was the hardest one to get into, because number one, I may have read one or two I, Vampire comics ever in my life, and certainly not any time in the past 20 years or more. And it really felt like you were in the middle of something. But even in that one, it feels like they're trying to drop all the signposts to get you up to speed, because in a short story, there's only so much exposition you can do. But it feels like I feel like every one of these is trying pretty hard to give you at least the bare minimum you need to understand why things feel significant, or why the story should feel important, or why the emotions should ring so true. It feels like they're trying that. It doesn't always succeed, but I think they're trying to give a new reader the tools for that. And again, I felt like I was given the tools in I, Vampire, but I just didn't have the kind of the serial genre experience with the characters enough to really wind up caring one way or another about anything. Yeah,
I feel very similar, although I'm less convinced that the intended audience for Young Monsters in Love are people who aren't familiar with the DC universe. I agree that...
Oh, I don't think no.
To some degree, in most of these stories, not all of them, you're given maybe enough context to appreciate what's going on. But, and again, I used Man-Bat in this first story as an example. Even if you're familiar with, let's say, many DC titles, but you have no background whatsoever in Man-Bat, I think that some of what goes on in Nocturnal Animal would fly over your head. That's not that you can't, so to speak. And that's not to say that you can't enjoy the story. It's just that there's a lot of the character and the character's history packed into each of these stories that readers who aren't familiar with the characters are going to miss out on. And I tended to enjoy and appreciate the stories whose characters I was more familiar with in terms of their backstory, their history, and whatnot. So, like you, I have much less experience with iVampire than I do with Deadman or Raven or Solomon Grundy. And it's the iVampire story, The Turning of Deborah Dancer, and this is written by Elisa Quitney with art by Stephanie Hans. Not that the story wasn't good, I think it was, but because I'm just not as well versed with iVampire, I didn't feel that there was much that I could grab onto,
Yeah, I mean, and I felt a little bad for that, but again, because I really do think that it's trying to give you as much information as you need to understand what's at stake. Mm-hmm. But again, it's kind of the difference between like standalone graphic novels and continued serialized storytelling. When you've been reading a character for 30 or 40 years, even if you haven't read every single story, you've got certain expectations, and then a story, if it's going to play with those expectations, that little bit of a play can be so much more meaningful when your reader has this not just affection for a character, but kind of feeling as if you know so much about them already. And if you don't know it, it's harder to it's a harder trick to pull off. Again, I don't think anybody who's never read a DC comic would ever pick this thing up. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming anybody who'd pick it up would be a DC Comics fan, right? At least of some of the characters here already. Like you and me, we knew some of the stuff already, so there's some built-in appeal already. Yeah. And what's interesting in a book like this is that it's trying to look at these characters through a very specific emotional lens that usually you don't see, or at least not this concentrated in the short story form. Because there's always, superhero comics are always soap operas anyways. Romance is always built into the love and romance are always built into the form, but rarely is it the core of the story. And when you've got short stories, you've only got room for like kind of really one real main core, kind of emotional core for it. So to get the romance as a core of every one of these stories is kind of a novelty, right? To see these characters differently.
And you're right that every single one of these stories in this issue, Young Monsters in Love, as you would expect, have something to do with romance in one form or another. And I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of these stories are quite touching, and I use that phrase. The two, though, that really stand out to me, they're touching in their own way and deal with romance in some form or another, but there's something more humorous about them that made them stand out for me. And those are the Monsieur Mala and the Brain story, and then the Creature Commando stories. In the story Visibility with Monsieur Mala and the Brain, this is written by Steve Orlando with art by Nick Klein. There is the humor behind the very characters, right, of Monsieur Mala, who is this big gorilla figure, and then the Brain, who, well, is a brain of someone who years before had worked with the gorilla and trained him and educated him in certain ways. There's the romance there, right? Because the relationship between Monsieur Mala and the Brain can be quite touching in its own way. But I think that there is more humor embedded in this story, Visibility, than in most of the others. Something similar in Dear Velcoro, which is the Creature Commandos comic, and this is written by James Robinson and art by John McCrae. This has a humorous side to it as well. I mean, again, it's touchy and it deals with romance, but the individual characters who are members of the Creature Commandos are funny in how they interact.
Yeah, well, see, Creature Commandos is not something that I have a lot of experience with myself, so this one didn't do as much for me. Visually, I mean, I generally like James Robinson as a writer a lot. I don't know John McCrae's art very well, but I like what I'm seeing here. But again, I don't really know these characters so much, and it felt not obvious, but it didn't hold a lot for me. And again, part of that I think is because I have no investment in these characters. I had no pre-investment in the characters. But I mean, you got werewolves and vampires and Frankenstein and a Medusa fighting Nazis. I mean, there's something inherently funny and entertaining in that, just from the very premise.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Creature Commandos got their start in Weird War Tales. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I remember I was a big Weird War Tales fan when I was a kid. The thing that strikes me that is humorous about this story, Dear Velcoro, is how it begins and ends, because it's narrated, so to speak, by, I guess, the one human member of the Creature Commandos, Matt Shreve, and he's filing a report, and that's basically the narration we get at the very beginning and the very end. And then what's sandwiched in the middle are the various relationships between some of the monsters who make up the Creature Commandos.
Right.
I like that. And it's not as if I've read tons of Creature Commando comics, but I know who they are, and I liked the humor that was embedded in this story. But another story that really stood out to me is really not humorous at all, and this is the Dead Man contribution, Be My Valentine, written by Paul Dini with art by Gilliam March. I really like Dead Man as a character and the very concept of him. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to this story, but I thought that it was well done, and I loved March's art.
Yeah, and it's almost more of a it's kind of a love story. It's kind of a morality tale.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and it's trying to do something different with the character with the character a little bit also, because he talks about that memories generally aren't part of his experience. He will take over somebody, but he really kind of lives the life of this child.
Right, and I think that,
and the art, especially the Dead Man. Sorry, but the drawing of Dead Man himself, the artist has really studied their Neil Adams a lot.
Right, that's good.
Very
yeah.
Neil Adams looking deadline. Yeah,
yeah, and the basis of this story, I think, is right in line with the kind of character the Dead Man is. Right, because he's in the state he's in because before he died, he was quite a selfish individual. And so his ability to inhabit the lives of other people temporarily is kind of, a morality tale of its own, right? I mean, you slip into someone's skin in order to understand them. And he points out that memories really aren't a part of his shtick, right? It's not something that's a part of what he does. However, this is just another way for him, learning what someone has gone through to kind of atone for his past.
Right.
I enjoyed Young Monsters in Love more than I thought that I would. I think I enjoyed it more than the horror collection from October that the DC put out.
Yeah, I didn't see that one, but this is, again, I didn't necessarily connect with every single one of the stories, but again, just the very fact that they're trying to do something dealing with romance, but not being really obvious about it. It's not just like the superhero and his girlfriend. I don't think we have a story that's really like that at all, and that's kind of what you would expect from something like this. So they try to take it in at least a kind of a skewed directions,
right?
And not just because it's monsters, but the way that they deal with the kinds of love and the kinds of issues that are brought up as well. So it's and again, yeah, there's also some good slapstick and monster gory humor too.
So, we've talked about monster love, we've talked about romantic love, we've talked about forbidden love, we've talked about weird love. This is an episode of love.
Oh yeah. It's all it's the day. How could we not?
So, Gene, we started off with the first 2 issues of the anthology series Twisted Romance by various contributors. Then we looked at the very first issue of Justin Jordan and Donal Delay's Death of Love. After that, another Image comic, Bingo Love by T. Franklin and Jen Stange. Again, I'm not sure how you pronounce the last name. Then we looked at the latest collected volume of Craig Yo and Cletzia Gusoni's Weird Love, and weird it is. And then we wrapped up with DC Comics' Young Monsters in Love by a variety of different creators.
By many hands.
Really interesting things. I'm glad we did it this way. We looked at recent romance comics, because I think when I first suggested that we do so, I don't know if I had much in mind, because I didn't know if we would find that many romance comics, but we're lucky this year. There are quite a number.
We had a bundle.
That's right. And speaking of bundles, Gene, one great way of getting comics is having them bundled, and you can't find better prices on bundles than a discount comic book service. How's that for a segue? It's like you've been doing this for years. I'm the king of the segue. So yes, go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find unbelievable prices every month, not only on bundles, but on individual issues of comics. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know if, I dismiss what my co-hosts say. I'd like to find out. And see if maybe you have similar experiences as Special Person has had in listening to our episodes. No, I'm serious. Thank you very much, Special Person, for writing us. I appreciate the input. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or it can be just by email. If you want to just email the whole show, it's 2 guys, TWO guys, at comicsalternative.com. If you want to email me, I'm Gene at comicsalternative.com. And Derek, how can they reach you?
Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have a Slack channel, so come take part of that. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We have every corner of the internet covered for your comics entertainment needs.
That's right, and there may be more coverage in the weeks to come, so stay tuned for that. Who knows? We'll be all over the place, even more than we are now.
Wow.
Yep.
I'm curious.
Yes. Well, Gene and I will be back next week with more comics fun. Probably not romantic comics, because we did that this week, but great comics nonetheless. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene.
See you later.
Take care.